Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard Podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B, PB Crisp, Mr. 645, a highly trained rail enthusiast who hopes to one day get the stream done somewhere less than 12 hours late. And I'm blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees, because the learning never ceases. And as always, it is great to be back behind this. The Brunswick Green PLB microphone. First of all, I hope you all had a very enjoyable Memorial Day weekend, and most importantly, that you took time out to thank those who gave their lives in the service of this great nation, because as much as we talk about how much we love trains, and we really do love trains a lot here, it wouldn't be something that we could enjoy or have the opportunity to talk about or otherwise were it not for those who gave their lives. So please take a moment, if you didn't already, over that holiday and thank them. Now, during that weekend, I grabbed my buddy Mike, who was interviewed a couple months ago on the All Aboard Podcast, Mike Allen. He and I went up to the Coldbrookdale Railroad in Boyertown, Pennsylvania. If you follow us on YouTube, then you probably know that we did a number of vlogs on that, and I hope you will take some time, if you're one of our audio listeners or Rumble listeners, to go over there and check them out. That's because I want to make sure that you have a little bit of a little insight into what actually goes on when you visit some of these railroads. And I want you to see as much of it in person as you possibly can. And I had a great time. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But I wanted to talk about what is a tourist railroad really. And frankly, as I think about it, it really does have a lot of definitions. First of all, when you look at private varnish, the folks who have purchased private cars or are renting space or chartering private cars, in a way, they are enjoying tourist railroading. It's just a different form of tourist railroading from that which we really think of. When you take a trip aboard one of the Union Pacific excursions, when they run them, the public excursions with the 4014, or the excursions by the Virginia Scenic Railroad and Buckingham Branch, plus Virginia Museum of Transportation, last year with N&W 484 number 611, that is tourist railroading. But more colloquially, we tend to think of tourist railroading as being something like I visited over the weekend, which is a relatively short railroad that primarily carries people back and forth within a relatively small area. And tourist railroading does have a very, very interesting history. And I would say the modern era really did grow out of a lot of the pleasure trips that railroads themselves would operate. Now, if you look behind me, you'll see, and I'll try to move out of the way there, a painting, a Griff Teller painting, was actually made into a calendar that depicts the Army-Navy game trains the Pennsylvania Railroad used to run. And the fun story about that is the trains would actually coast into the yard right near the stadium where it was held because there was no electrification. They had to be pulled back out, but they were often pulled by the GG1s to get there. And that's made for lots of great pictures, but most importantly, it was a good example of tourist railroading. A more recent example of that comes to us from New England, the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. They operate special trains for Patriot fans to go to Foxborough Stadium to see their terrible team. I'm sorry. As a Jets fan, I shouldn't say that, but all kidding aside, they do operate passenger specials there. That's something that's actually been going on since the Penn Central era, if not earlier, because if you search deep enough into rail pictures, you will, in fact, find Penn Central versions of those trains going to Foxborough, where Gillette Stadium now and previously Foxborough Stadium was located. And then you really did see this take off, though, after the decline of the steam locomotive. And that's really because, just like anything else, most Americans were looking at railroads and railroading as being a part of daily life. And so they didn't think of it very much as something that needed to be cherished. After all, think about in the 1930s, railroading had only been around for 100 years and most certainly not in the form that it was being operated at that time, which was the very large captains of industry leading the entire economy, moving the entire economy, and being the primary way that people got from point A to point B. So once you started to see the steam locomotive, which was the iconic vision of railroading, go away, that's when you started to see more people say, hey, I want to go ahead and enjoy that nostalgia. And so you saw some of that with Paulson Spence, and we talked about Paulson Spence back in episode 46, and the collection of steam locomotives that he put together from a variety of areas as part of an effort to build a new railroad that would have been steam powered. And it looks like Paulson Spence's interest in that, of course, stemmed from not only his love of trains, but also the work he had done to sell steam valves for decades prior to getting into railroading, and most notably quarry, rock, aggregate, and so forth in the 1940s and into the 1950s. But also, another example of that is the Strasburg. Oh, let me back up. Paulson Spence did operate excursions with his steam locomotives. And then in the 1950s, you saw the Strasburg Railroad in 1959 begin operating its modern day tourist railroading, which of course takes people from the station just adjacent to the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in Strasburg out to Lehman Place, also known as Paradise, where the line connects with the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is now owned by Amtrak, where they operate the passenger, and the freight service is provided by Norfolk Southern. So, why are we talking about this? Well, it's like I said, went out to see the Colebrookdale Railroad, made me think a little bit. So, here is a little bit of background on the Colebrookdale. First of all, it operates a little more than 8 miles of trackage. And for those of you who are on CP5 cam, as you know, we're going to try our best, always try our best, to get a little bit of the vision of what it is. And unfortunately, due to some technical difficulties, I was not able to get some of my wonderful digital pictures of it up. But I will tell you, the Colebrookdale Railroad is great. We're going to try to get the website for you in a picosecond. Let's see if we're able to. And I know if you're listening, you're probably thinking, gosh, is he really, really this bad? I'm not really this bad. I'm a highly trained rail enthusiast. I'm not quite, as I say, a highly trained broadcast specialist. But there you go. That is the website of the Colebrookdale Railroad. And what you notice about it is very interesting. First of all, the video that you're seeing is actually taken in Boyertown, and that is where they have built a very, very interesting yard facility where you are able to not only were Canadian National and Maine Central passenger cars. Now, Canadian National cars are very interesting because for many years, the end of their life, they actually operated out of Montreal on the service that Canadian National used to operate through the Mount Royal Tunnel. That's now provided by EXO, which is successor to CTCUM or STCUM, as well as AMT. And I'm not going to try to pronounce that. There's a lot of very, very interesting French words in all of those names. And as somebody who doesn't want an entire province of Canada to come down on him for mispronouncing everything, I won't do that. But before those agencies took over operation of the trains, they're actually operated by Canadian National, and they were pulled by both General Electric and English Electric box cabs. And a few of those box cabs have been preserved. If I recall correctly, it was all the General Electric box cabs that managed to survive. And there are several in a variety of places, and I think one is actually in South Carolina. But that was always an operation that I wanted to visit as a kid, because I even recognized then, hey, this is something that is very old. It's something that we're probably not going to have for much longer. And unfortunately, before I had a chance to do it, Canadian National, they ended up turning that service over to AMT, and they not only electrified it, but they electrified it with modern, for the time in the 1990s, Bombardier MUs, and those have since been replaced again. So there's been a lot of change going through the Mount Royal Tunnel. I believe they made it into something that's a little bit more like a light rail operation as opposed to the heavy rail operation that's been. But all that's to say that this is the primary equipment that they're using at the Coalbrookdale Railroad. Now, it's all been restored in a very, very, very ornate fashion, including a lot of stained glass windows, stained glass siding in the clerestory roofs. I mean, it is tremendous, and when you walk through the cars, it is very apparent to the level of detail with which they've decided to do it. Another thing that's very interesting about the Coalbrookdale Railroad and their equipment consist is the flat car, and the one that we rode yesterday was a 1910 built gondola that has been converted to a flat car. And this is where you can actually stand outside on the car as the train is rolling through the railroad version of a canopy road. If you're from any area where they have canopy roads, you know how cool it is. Well, this is the railroad version of a canopy road, and you're out there, and so you can see it, and it's kind of surreal because you're basically in this tree cocoon with the occasional rock face and old mill out there as you're rolling through. Now, you're only going about 10 miles an hour, and the 8-mile trip takes about 2 hours. However, during that time, they have great narration, and they also have, at least in the trip we rode, you had the parents of the executive director who were working the grill, cooking up hot dogs and hamburgers, and while there were different classes of service, coach, diner, and lounge, everybody had the ability to get either a cheeseburger or a hot dog and a hamburger. Now, why do I mention all that? Well, it's to say that they managed to find a way to take what would be, I guess you would probably call a, low-end operation and make it something that has become highly successful and highly sought after by not only rail fans, but more importantly, the people who they really draw from, which is mostly families. Now, Coalbrookdale is located in Berks County. It runs between Boyertown and Pottstown, and it's not that far from both the Strasburg Railroad as well as the tourist operations of the Reading, Blue Mountain, and Northern. Now, the RBM&N, of course, they run as far south as Reading, or North Reading, as they call at Reading Outer Station, as they call it, and then as far north as Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. A little bit further north of that is Steamtown, and then to the south of Coalbrookdale, of course, is the Strasburg itself over near Lancaster. And so what I found to be interesting about Coalbrookdale is the fact that it's not a preservation operation. Nothing that you see there is being built or rebuilt or maintained for the purpose of saying, well, this is what this locomotive was like in 1952. Or this is what the line was like if you were traveling it in 1935. It is a great way to use the train as a vehicle to go back into history and learn about the surrounding area. It's also a way that you use the train as a vehicle to bring people in and get them involved in the tourist aspect of the area. And they've got a lot of different things they're doing, not only, as I mentioned, the downtown area, which they basically built a town center that's focused on the railroad. The B&O baggage car that I mentioned earlier also functions as their creamery. So whether you're riding the train or not, and you and your family want to have some ice cream, you can go right down there the same way you might go down to the Dairy Queen and get ice cream. But in this case, you'd be getting it from the railroad itself. And I was lucky enough to have a chance to chat with the executive director, and he shared a lot of the things that he is planning to do. And we're not going to talk about them here for the simple fact that I would much rather let him talk about them and get that message out. But I can tell you this, that what they're doing is going so far beyond what you typically expect with a rail operation, particularly a tourist rail operation, that it is something that, should it continue to grow and they're able to accomplish a lot of what they want to do, it's certainly going to be more like the tourist leader of the city and what draws people into that area. And I want to remind you, Boyertown, while it's someplace that the majority of you haven't heard of, it is very much within both the New York and Philadelphia area tourist markets. And both of those are interesting because both of those cities are very large tourist meccas on their own. So if you live in the area of them, they are the kind of places that will typically draw your dollars. However, that doesn't mean that residents who are there aren't willing to travel, although they typically do like to take day trips. Now, I want to stress this. For Philadelphia, the average household income is $56,517. New York City, that's higher at $74,694. And Morristown, New Jersey, which is a suburb of New York City, that number hits $113,926. So, why do I mention that? Well, you look at those levels of household income, you look at the people who live there, what you're going to find, especially with the families, even the small families, because we talk a lot about how demographics have shifted and people are having fewer children if they are marrying, in fact. But those families do have the capability to go out and do something like spend more than $100 to put 4 people, mom, dad, and 2 kids, on a rail bike, for example, which is one of the services they offer, or to go aboard the train and have dinner as a family, and certainly set up for that. Again, this is something that they offer, so that's a great way that you can draw that wealth in. And the Coalbrookdale, like the Strasburg and the Reading Blue Mountain and Northern, also have something else in common, and that is they are both around and in Pennsylvania Dutch country. And what makes that such a draw is you have artisans, you have food, just smorgasbords and so forth that's very much unlike what you're going to find in the New York City, North Jersey, South Jersey, Philadelphia area. Completely different from that. You have the arts and the crafts that you can get, and you also have the ability to see the Amish people up close, and that means their horses, their buggies, you name it. It's the ability to go and basically go to another era and another almost world within driving distance. And one of the best things that you can do when you go to those areas is travel by train, and certainly Coalbrookdale does fit in with that. Now, what do I think the future is with the Coalbrookdale Railroad? Well, I think it's very bright because, again, having talked with their executive director, Nathaniel Guest, he is somebody that comes from the hospitality industry and somebody who's a leader there. So he certainly understands the fact that it's not enough simply to sell a ticket, or of course in hospitality selling a room. It's not just enough to do that. You have to find a way that you can build repeat customers and give them some reason to come back to a place where they might do it maybe once a year otherwise, or maybe twice a year at most. So I believe if there's anybody that has the capability to do it, it certainly is him. And I do like the approach that he's taken, which again is using the railroad as a centerpiece of the community, not trains for train's sake, but trains for the sake of drawing tourist dollars in and then trying to capture as many of those as possibly can. What are some of the challenges? Well, they have been receiving freight, and that includes Coke, not coal, Coke. They have some different feed. I believe there's chicken feed and a couple other commodities that they do receive. They don't have a lot of track space for what's there, so that was one of the things I noticed. Relatively short spurs, so that means that it'll take a lot more in order to capture more of that freight business. Although this being an area of the country that still does have a surprising amount of industry, even though it is a very rural area, outside of Boyertown itself, you will notice, and also Pottstown, you will notice that is a good opportunity for them to grow. Another challenge that they face is the fact that they do have to work through a public entity which actually owns the track. So regardless of how these agreements are structured, if you are operating a publicly owned piece of railroad, whoever is the owner, whether it is a city, a state, or an economic development authority, they are going to have a say in what you can do and how you can do it. And that also means the ability to collateralize your largest fixed asset, which is the land under your track, doesn't exist. So that means that they have to be very, very creative in how they approach those financings. And while I don't have any kind of inside info on that, how that ends up playing out is going to have a big impact on the future of the Coalbrookdale Railroad as it's currently structured. But I can say that the staff is tremendous. The executive director does a great job, and I think it's someplace that if you are looking for a tourist railroad to visit, whether you are a rail enthusiast like me and you want to see the motor car that came from the Arizona and Eastern Railroad, the GP9 from the Pennsylvania, the GP38-2 that was originally from the Southern Railway and has a high hood, plus those coaches that I mentioned earlier, Pennsylvania Bi-War Bonds Caboose, you name it. If you want to see all that and you want to see some good old-time railroading, it's a great place to go. If you're more of a casual person, you think trains are neat, you have a family to go see, take them there. And while you're there, there is also an auto museum, which is the, we're going to make sure we get this right, the Boyertown Museum of Historic Vehicles, because there was at one point a very, very strong automotive and truck manufacturing industry that operated in Boyertown and Durea, I believe, is what was built there. So it's certainly a multi-transportation effort if you choose to go visit the Coalbrookdale Railroad in Boyertown. Now, another that I'd like to highlight is the Reading, Blue Mountain, and Northern. And we had to talk about that for several reasons. First of all, because I was blessed back in 2022, the first year that 2102, which is the Reading, one of 4 surviving Reading T1 484 steam locomotives, went back into operation. And this one, of course, is owned personally by Andy Muller, who owns the Reading, Blue Mountain, and Northern all by himself. And a fun story about Andy Muller, I, as you know, want to own my own railroad, something I've been working on for a long time. And I was driving through Hamburg, Pennsylvania, and I'd gone there because I wanted to see the Reading Company Technical and Historic Society's museum, and this was before Christmas of 2018. So I went there, and Christmas of 2017. So I went there, and I saw Andy Muller's jewelry store, because he had been involved in silver and jewelry and a variety of other things, including being a teacher, before he started the Reading and Northern, which at the time was the Blue Mountain Reading. And I saw it, and I said, well, you know what? I got to at least try to talk to the guy. Of course, it was closed because this was Christmas Eve. And so I took my business card and I wrote on the back, hey, look, my name is Phil Bell. I've actually always wanted to run a railroad of my own. I'd really like to talk to you. And put my phone number, of course, on the front of the card. Slipped it under the door. Didn't think much of it. Enjoyed the museum. Went on up to New Jersey. Had a great time with my family for Christmas. Well, a few days later, I'm in my office and I get a call from who? Andy Muller. And he talked to me for about 10 minutes. Gave me some really interesting insights into what they do at the Reading, Blue Mountain, and Northern. Could not have been a nicer person. And for somebody like that leads a railroad, to take the time to call a random guy who left his business card under the door at his jewelry store, that really meant something to me. So I've become a big fan of the Reading, Blue Mountain, and Northern. And that's before we talk about the quality of their operations. Now, as I mentioned, what they do is they have started to operate a variety of rail excursions. And so when they got the T1, providing excursions. And Jim Thorpe is a tourist mecca. In fact, Jim Thorpe, just like Boyertown, is ensconced, very well ensconced, in the New York City metropolitan, exurban, I guess you could say super exurban area. And the reason why I call it that is for the people in New York City and North Jersey who want to make day trips, there is no problem for them to drive out to Jim Thorpe. And Jim Thorpe having become a tourist mecca in its own right outside of the railroad, in part because of Jim Thorpe himself, who had no connection to the city other than the fact that he was buried there, and that's because the city wanted to bury him there, so that way they could have a name. It was actually called Mach Chunk before. Or the fact that you have, so that's one. Number two, you have the Lehigh River, where there is water, kayaking is offered, and I also believe paddle boats, in addition to great hiking in the area and biking opportunities in the area. So that's why I wanted you to see this for those of you who are watching on CP5. Beale and Northern number 425, Reading Blue Mountain Northern number 425. So they operate those two. They also have diesel excursions that are powered by whatever the railroad has available. In a lot of cases, that it tends to be the EMD F9s that they purchased from Norfolk Southern, 4270 and 4271, which later on were number 270 and 271. Actually, check that. It was 4270 and 4275. The other unit, the other B unit, that went down to North Carolina, and I will get you a photo of that because, quite frankly, if we aren't giving you photos of EMD, E units, or F units, then it means I probably haven't done my job very well on this podcast. And so there you go. But there again, as you see the 270, and this was during one of the excursions that I managed to ride there, you would see, of course, that this is a place that's certainly not railroad only, but where the railroad is able to make a profound impact by adding a lot of tourists to it, and also giving people the opportunity to utilize that as part of the tourism that they want to do. And one example, the Lehigh Gorge Scenic Railway, which is the unit of the Reading Blue Mountain and Northern that provides the services, excursion services within the Lehigh Gorge, they have trains where you can take your bike on the train going one way and then ride back the other. They also, I believe, do something with the paddle boats and so forth. So that's also another way that you can utilize the train as part of your overall recreational activities. So what is noteworthy, though, about the Reading Blue Mountain Northern is that it is primarily a freight railroad. Andy Muller will tell you that it is primarily a freight railroad. But these other activities have the added benefit of not only the great public relations that comes with it, but additional revenue that it brings in. To the extent that it's profitable, I don't know, but it does bring in substantial revenue, and that, for a railroad, is a great benefit to cash flow, so long as any losses that are incurred are relatively small. And that's for the reason that the more cash that you have coming in the door, the more you're going to be able to put money into whatever it is that needs repair at that time. That can include the locomotives, that can include upgrading the lines, that can even include servicing debt that you are taking on as part of overall capital improvements. And that is really the number that bankers, private equity investors, and otherwise look at when they are judging if these private companies like the Reading Blue Mountain and Northern are able to receive the capital that they need in order to improve their operations and not only stay afloat, but be a strong, growing provider of any and all of the services that they offer. But again, just as with the Colebrookdale Railroad, the Reading Blue Mountain and Northern is not a preservation operation. You can go there and ride former DL&W MU cars. You can go there and ride former Milwaukee and Santa Fe Superdomes. You can go there and ride behind some beautiful EMD F units and, of course, the 2102 and so on. But nothing that you see there is preserved in the historical standpoint. It is all being done for the purpose of creating new memories as opposed to saving the past to be seen by those in the future. And that's really where I wanted to leave this, because that's primarily the difference between preservation on one hand and tourist railroading on the other. Now, what I encourage you to do is please go out and ride as many of the tourist railroads that you can if you are a rail enthusiast. And that's because something that was really impressed upon me while I was out on the Colebrookdale was that not all of these tourist railroads are going to be around forever. Some of them may go away. Now, that's not saying that about the RBM&N or the Colebrookdale, but you never know what's there until it's gone. So I encourage you to take a trip. I also want to give a shout out to our engineer. He is a customer of us here at All Things Trains, brought some of our memorabilia. Great guy, and did a very, very good job. Smooth train handling the whole way. And it is a very difficult thing. And, we talked about going 10 miles an hour. There's a lot of parts of that line where you are incredibly close to the rock walls. And they are not kidding when they say, don't put anything outside of the car that you want to get back. So for everybody who's thinking, look, I'm going to ride the train and, wave my hands outside. No. That's not the place where you want to do that, because you will probably come back with a claw arm or a peg leg or something like that. But it was a great experience, and I encourage you. It was, and also the multiple trips that I've taken on the Reading Blue Mountain and Northern, including the Reading Rambles that they're doing. And so please ride the trains. And if you're like me and you're a rail enthusiast, make sure to take one trip where you ride and then one trip where you chase. And they don't have to be the same day, but do that, because that will get revenue in the hands of these railroads and help them know that doing this is something that they can find worthwhile. And, even if you're doing something like maybe you can't ride one day, but go and buy some memorabilia, go buy some ice cream, go buy whatever, buy something they're selling, contribute some revenue. It's not that these are struggling businesses that need our dollars, that there's some kind of charity cases, but we want trains to be around, and anting up even just a little bit is something that can be helpful. So we will be back on Wednesday for our 50th show. And on that 50th show, we are going to go over one of my favorite magazine issues. It'll be one of those, and talk about how that helped me get into railroading and how you can use this media to also help you learn more about that and plan what you're going to do in the industry, whether you're talking about investing for some of you who are rail investors, or you're a public policy person who's helping make policy related to railroads and transportation, or you're like me and you are a highly trained rail enthusiast and you just want to learn more about the rail industry and immerse yourself in it further. So thank you again for being with us. Thank you for sticking with us despite the 12+ hour delay that we have had here. As always, it's great to be back with you, and we will see you again down the main line on Wednesday.